mention on slide 3 or 4 for me. So one thing that we're often tasked with in different types of curricula are integrating content across the curriculum. And so for years and years, we've had these kind of silo curricula where you just have one content in this course here and then content in this course here and so forth and so on. And if you have students that are tasked with eventually having to put all that content together, we're really putting that all on the student to do outside of class or even outside the framework of the curriculum. So what we want to do with instead of putting that on the student outside the classroom is allow us as faculty to guide that process for them. So the why here is we want to increase long-term student retention of content, and we want to help them see the big picture. So in my background has been in health professions education, both in vet and human medicine, and we have students that come through our programs that are preparing to be clinicians, and they most certainly have to take various pieces of content, bring them together to see the big picture to help diagnose and treat patients. And so having formative assessment items, or whether it's a case or even just a problem set, is a great way to help bring that information together to force students to think critically on the various types of content provided, to bring that together to then apply it and think critically, and in our case, think clinically to solve a problem. And so with those bottom 3 notes, as you can see here, what we're able to do with the AI is create open-ended, higher order thinking questions and engage students with that course content. So this is the neat thing about it. You can not only can you prompt the AI to write questions for you on a given topic. For, let's say, I'm going to use medicine again as an example. I can prompt it that histologically, our students are learning this in a lesson, include this. Pharmacologically, include that. Pathologically, include this. So we're able to give it prompts to include certain, pieces of information on different parts of medicine. So whether that's, biochemistry or physics or medicine, there's different pieces of content that students need to bring together, and we can tell the AI to bring that together. Again, now that we have these formative assessment items, we need that deliverable. And that's why I copy and paste that into Nearpod. And you have to think about how you want to then engage. Now, on the flip side of bringing content together to have students to practice and get those critical thinking reps is activating prior knowledge. So if you've taught for any number of years, this learning environment where you're going to do that. Let's just use flipped classroom because that tends to be the most popular one that we've heard over the last 2 decades or so. That students have to have some prior knowledge to come to the classroom, and then we would have some sort of individual readiness. Or if you're doing team-based learning, we did an individual and then group readiness assurance test. Now with and that's the way that we want to make sure that students are prepared to work in their groups, right? So students are going to work in a small group. We want to make sure that they're capable of keeping up with their group, and B, we want them to be able to contribute to the group. So we have to confirm there's a certain baseline of knowledge. This idea with prior knowledge is basically that preparing students for a group learning session and applied to even just a lecture session. So what we've seen through the COVID years is that it was very easy for students to matriculate throughout programs, whether that's K-12, higher ed, grad school, And however, even though they were matriculating through those programs, it was a really difficult time to learn and teach. So it's very possible that students may not have comprehended certain, may not have been competent in certain areas, but they were still able to move through the programs. So the idea with the activating prior knowledge is to have a series of questions at the beginning of your lecture, and you can brand it however you want to have different thoughts there. Sometimes quiz can be kind of a scary term for students, but what you want to do is address basic terms or concepts that students need to know for that day's lesson. So if you are going, so truly, it should be activating prior knowledge. And if students, 90% of students get the questions that you ask correct, that's a good thing because it means that they are prepared to learn that day. However, that 10% of students that may be falling behind if they don't know that information, you're able to kind of bring them up in preparation for that day's lesson. So truly just basic terms that if you don't know these concepts, you're not going to understand what we're talking about today. And of course, as the bottom note says, it's really important to give brief feedback so before you start the lesson. So if you do 5 questions, go back to those 5 questions really quickly. I've seen faculty in our program here do this really well, where they'll spend no more than 10, 15 seconds per question just saying, hey, everyone, the answer is B because of this. I saw some folks select C. Don't forget it's not C because of that. And then they move on. So now you set this baseline of knowledge that all students have, and now they're prepared to learn in that day's lesson. So with feedback needs, or with assessment needs to come feedback. And if you do a formative assessment and you don't have feedback, it really can be just an empty exercise because students may not truly understand where they're doing well or where they're struggling. And as you can see there, I have the word meaningful underlined. And so we want to be able to streamline meaningful feedback for students. And meaningful feedback means that it's timely, so closely after the assessment that they've taken, but also quality. And quality feedback should be really related to the learning goal and as much as possible to the student performance about the content. So we don't want to just say, hey, you got an 85, which is a B, because there's going to be plenty of students. And to be honest, during part of my academic career, I probably was that student as well that would have said, hey, an 85, pretty cool. I'm going to just roll with that. Mom won't be too upset about that. Just move on. But we want it, but there's still 15% of points that they're leaving out there, which means they're struggling in a given area. And so we want to be able to give students feedback so they can self-assess on where they're not performing well there. So with formative assessment, you can do preloaded feedback. And this is one of the things I love about using the AI and I love about marrying it with Nearpod is that you're able to have the assessment items made, but you can also ask the AI for a rationale and as to why the correct answers are correct. And then since Nearpod is, as you're seeing right now, a slide-based linear tool that I'm controlling the pace of, that you can have it built into where students have the assessment item, and then the next slide is the rationale explaining why the correct answer is the correct answer. So they don't have to wait on you releasing scores. You aren't, under the pressure of grading, student performances and releasing information to all of them in one fell swoop. And also, you don't have this varying time of giving that feedback. It's truly immediate feedback to student performance right there in the presentation. Students are taking, they'll get the feedback and then they can continue to build and scaffold throughout that lesson. And again, you can do that truly by, as I mentioned a few slides ago, taking the content from a slide, a video transcript, an article, asking the AI to write questions along with the rationale explaining why it's correct. It won't be perfect. It will be a really, really great starting point. Sometimes it'll be more than a starting point. It will be, pretty good. And then you can take that and it just becomes an exercise in copying and pasting to get it set up. But again, you control that pace. Again, you can do that with in-class assessments as well, not just the asynchronous problem sets. For summative assessments, it's great that you can do almost a post-exam review through where you can have the AI write rationales. You can, if you're comfortable putting your exam items in there, and some folks really are, some aren't. I totally get that. That's a personal preference. If you are comfortable putting your exam items in, you can copy and paste them into ChatGPT ask them to create a rationale. As I have there, you can even ask them to include the distractors and say, not only tell me why the correct answers are the correct answers, but why are the distractors incorrect? And so now you're able to provide feedback for students as far as, really, the important piece of that meaningful feedback of the quality of the why. So if they did get an item wrong, then they're able to have a better understanding as to why. But then also, if they got it correct, I mean, multiple choice, if it's 4 question items, then you have no idea. There's still a 25% chance you can blindly guess and get it correct. And if that's the case, they can still see the why of why it's correct and have that be a learning opportunity, and not just have this uh, you know overinflated idea of their performance, but really can see the why of what's correct and what's incorrect. And again, with it being slide based in Nearpod, you're able to go either question by question, groups of questions. You can group content together. There's different ways you can do that. That's most appropriate for your content. A few more things, and then we'll get into a quick little demo of how I tend to work with this, and then we'll get to Q&A at the end. So other practical assignments or assessments, I mentioned rubrics before. One of the things with practical assessments that's really tough to do is to standardize feedback. One example I'd like to think from my own teaching career is when I was a young teacher. I was 23 years old, and I was really excited about giving students. I gave students a 5-page paper. I taught social studies, and I told them too. I was like, I wasn't going to be that teacher that made them wait a week to get their feedback back. I was going to grade them over the weekend. Well, I didn't really do the math in advance, and I had 240 students, and I gave a 5-page paper. So you can do the math on how many pages that was. It was not a very fun weekend, but as you all are probably aware, the version of me that graded paper one against the version of me that graded paper 240 was a totally different Dan, and most certainly gave different feedback. And I probably read an exponentially fewer amount of words per paper as I went through that practice, just as whether it's boredom, my brain being overwhelmed, or just personal survival. So a rubric, which I didn't have at the time, would have really been a great way for me to standardize that feedback across, so that while sure I would have been overwhelmed still, I would have had a guide to be able to provide meaningful feedback to students, and it would have helped keep me honest in my grading to make sure that it's standardized across all students. So whether that's practical as far as students performing a task with your coursework or content, or something like a paper, you can create a rubric really easy. When you create a rubric, ask it to put it in a table, and it will create a table. And then I tend to put it into either Google Forms or Google Docs from there. Um, Other items I mentioned before, the case studies, and that's really that middle note, the more reps or practice for students with critical thinking tests. That's cases to or problem sets, whatever works best for your content, in a way that allows students to think critically about the content that they've learned. I've heard from various institutions and different levels of students that their students are really great. They can be good memorizers, and that's what students really want to do, is be spoon-fed content, and then take study. They cram, they take the exam, and then after they purge and they move on. So we want to put in learning opportunities for students, for them to actually apply that content and think critically. And so if whether that's as I was mentioning here a bunch today, the case studies, we also can have students interact with AI created content as well. So we can have students evaluate or edit. Again, I'm going to use case study as my example. We can have them evaluate those to make sure that the AI is creating appropriate content, which, as I mentioned before, we do need that human element. It's not going to be perfect. If you do have AI produced content that really is spot on, prompt it to make mistakes. I just, in testing for this presentation, I asked it to make obvious mistakes, and it made some really silly obvious mistakes. Then I asked it to have it make more discrete mistakes that students with content knowledge would have, would um, they would need to be able to figure that out, to whereas the average Joe like me couldn't solve a vet med case based on some of these obvious mistakes. And it does a great job of deciphering between obvious and discrete with what those mistakes should be, that students should then be able to um, um, identify. And next level from that is, after they identify the mistake, they can give you the why and even what should be changed to make it correct. Other things that you can do is, and I have a prompt in the next couple slides. We'll talk through some of those. Another thing that I really like about these critical thinking tasks is after students do go through a case or a problem set, is that for an exit ticket idea, is to have students write their own future learning objectives. So basically, based on what they learned um, in that activity that day, what more do they need to learn about that topic that can, in our case, help them better treat similar patients in the future. For example, if you talk a little bit about content A, what do students need to know more about content A to get them to content B? So and the research shows that students, when writing their own learning objectives, tend to actually push themselves beyond what faculty tend to with the objectives that they create for them. And then finally, we always want to do this when increase engagement with applying knowledge. And so again, whether it's students using rubrics to evaluate a presentation that their classmates are giving, so they get to think critically about what information their classmates are providing, whether that's having students go through cases and answer critical thinking questions. One thing I like to do with the cases as well that I create is not only have open-ended questions with them, but then also have multiple choice questions, because we tend to use multiple choice questions on our written exams, our summative exams. But B, if you do have some sort of board or licensure exam, students are taking multiple choice questions there and need to have practice with distractors as well. So you get them to think critically with open-ended questions, but also get them to practice for those licensure type questions. But it does give you the opportunity to provide that, again, formative assessment feedback after they apply that knowledge. As I've mentioned before, if you ask the AI to create critical thinking questions, difficult questions, however you want to word it, it does a pretty good job of doing that as well. And then you would just think about your application in the Nearpod. Would you make it open-ended to have students think critically? Are you preparing them for that licensure exam and you want to do multiple choice with immediate feedback? There's different ways to go about that too. And one other item before I move on from here is that if you have students that are struggling in a certain content area, it's really tough to find time as faculty to remediate them. And it's also tough to tell students, hey, you're struggling with topic A, you really need to go work on that more. But with the being able to use AI to create problem sets, cases, questions off articles, all the things I mentioned before, you can direct students specifically to these self-paced Nearpod modules that you can create, as I mentioned before, with a whole lot of copy and paste. So that instead of saying, hey, you need to be better at topic A, you can say, hey, I'm going to assign you some modules that you need to work through. And it can be related to that content in which they're struggling. And again, in the process, you can still do, since we're talking about self-paced, slide-based presentation, provide students information, provide assessment items, provide rationale and feedback for those assessment items. So it really does become a valuable learning opportunity for them. And we'll mention reports here in a little bit. So this is actually mentioned reports on this slide. So this is my process. This is what I do each time I go through and work with ChatGPT to create a self-paced or live presentation in Nearpod, is to identify my goals. What do I want to get out of this? What do I want students to get out of this? Whether that's what my actual learning objectives are, and whether I write them or I ask for help from the AI, or is there a certain level of engagement? Is it a practical exercise I want students to do? Do I want to try and reinforce basic concepts that they really need to know before I move on? Whatever that is, I identify that first and foremost. Secondly, I always want to simplify and specify what the prompt is. And as you can see, the subnote, the more descriptive you are, the better your results. And I have a prompt ready to go right now that I'll show here in our ChatGPT. We also, and you want to be as clear as possible, as I mentioned before, and you'll get better at it. If you haven't used it much, the more that you use it, the better, like the AI trains you almost to be able to put the appropriate prompt in there. If you're co-editing, I always mention, I like to throw it in a Google Doc or form or sheet or whatever the appropriate medium is for that, so you can all live edit. Once you have your editing done, I always copy and paste it in Nearpod. Remember that even if it's a self-paced lesson for students, you still control that learning experience, because you can still have it go slide by slide, as opposed to just posting a PDF. I often if you're familiar with the game show Jeopardy, I always like to joke about that this is kind of the Jeopardy effect, where if you were to post just a PDF of a case in this case or a problem set with the answers at the bottom, a very high percentage of students are going to scroll to the bottom of that PDF and look at what that diagnosis and treatment plan is for the case or what the answers are to that problem set. And then as they go through the questions or the article or the case or whatever, they're going to be reading it through this rose-colored glasses of that they know what the answer is. Kind of like when you watch the game show and you're sitting on your couch and you think you know what the answer is, but you don't actually get it out in time. And the first thing most people say is, "Oh, I knew that." But in reality probably had heard it before, but not necessarily knew it. That's what we're kind of doing with our students if we just post a PDF or Word doc, is allowing them to have this false sense of, oh, I knew that with what the treatment plan is for a patient, when in reality they had already, they're reading the case knowing what the answer is. So we want to avoid that. And if we have something that's in the self-paced module, slide by slide, we can truly have students engage with the content when we want them to engage it, but then also have the assessment and the assessment feedback in the appropriate way that's best for their learning. Once you're done with producing those self-paced or live participation modules, then it's just a matter of running your Nearpod reports and then identifying where students are struggling. If we're going to do these assessments and formative, especially formative assessments, they're two-way communication streets. So I'm telling students what the important pieces of the content are by what I'm assessing them on. So my assessment shouldn't be trivial. At the same time, students are communicating back to me what they know about the content. And so now that we've had that exchange of, what's important to each of us as far as our knowledge that we've already gained, and then of course what we're trying to highlight in the content, we can look at those reports to truly see how students are doing throughout the cohort. So if you have a large classroom of 100 plus students, you're able to look and see themes throughout students' performance to see where they're doing well or where they're struggling. So moving forward, whether it's that current year or in preparation for the next year, where you may need to make some remediation or changes in your teaching to make sure that students aren't continuing to struggle in a given area. So with that being said, I'm going to jump over. If you're checking my screen out, stay with me for a quick second. I'm going to open up to where we have this shared Google Doc, but I do want to show what that process looks like in ChatGPT. So on my screen now, if you're looking at the shared, I have just an open ChatGPT session, and just because I didn't want to type in front of a whole bunch of people and make a bunch of typos, I'm copy and pasting a prompt. So the prompt at the bottom of the screen is something I mentioned at a vet med school. It's something that I typically would do. And as you can see, I'm not giving it very much information. Write a case study about a cat with dental disease. I always say please and thank you to the AI. Please also include 5 open-ended questions and 5 difficult multiple choice questions that assess students' knowledge of that content. And then I also ask you to indicate the correct answer and write a rationale. So as you can see, it really goes from here and creates the case for me. And one of the things that I've done with in professional development and also in preparation for student learning is to take these cases and have it be something that's shared that can easily be interacted with by students. So we have our clinical exam and diagnostic tests and diagnosis. And oftentimes, this is how most cases are created. Now, these open-ended questions can be something that you copy and paste directly into the Nearpod and have as something that students can do live in class, whether it's in small groups or individual. And same with the multiple choice questions that are created. As you can see, as it's creating these multiple choice questions, that rationale is something that I'm already looking at to see if it's something I can copy and paste and put on the slide after, or if it's something I need to edit for students. If you want more distractors, instead of A through D, if you want it to be A through E, ask it to do that, and it will. Just again, as I mentioned before, the more descriptive you are, the better results you get. Now, in most of the medical world that I've worked in, even though I'm not a content expert, faculty often want to provide a differential diagnosis and blood panel for patients as far as tests. So I'm going to wait for this to get done. And I also would like, it didn't give me the differential diagnosis. So I can ask it for that as well to add, which is just another layer of a way that I can assess my students, really is why, in this case, I'm asking for this. So while it's finishing that up for me, I can take this case study, and as far as how to, marry this into Nearpod, if I in my Google Doc, hey, oh, let's do this. Let's make it easier to see. I now, if you're in my Nearpod, you can see I now have this case study that AI created. And I can give students prompts like you see here at the top to evaluate the case and find inaccuracies. And if so, highlight them and correct them. Or to describe, why. So I have a prompt on the differential diagnosis. Well, it's as easy as just going over here and wow, they gave me 9 differential diagnoses, quite a bit. I can then add that in here and ask students. Obviously, I would highlight and bold the way that the program did, but I can ask it to do a rule out of how to change those differential diagnoses to make them actually be something that they can tell me why the differential diagnosis is incorrect. For example, it also can help students that are at the early on in the program. If you give them the differential diagnosis, it gives them a starting point to see where they may want to actually go to solve that diagnosis. And then it really provides you so many different opportunities here as far as whether or not you want students to think critically as far as if they're third or fourth year students in your program, let's say, to have them think critically and answer those questions that I have here at the top, such as what changes need to be made to make 2 of the differential diagnoses correct, or it can literally be which of those differential diagnoses is correct and provide 2 sources as to why it is correct. So you have different ways you can engage students. And again, this is all with I can see a whole bunch of folks in here right now. This is all within the Nearpod. So you can have students work in small groups, or you can have students work individually. This can be self-paced. This can be live in class. There's plenty of ways that you get them to then engage with said content. Sorry for all these that are still working in here. I'm going to move on. Okay. One other thing I've done in the past is when we have case studies, I like to have students to present the case study. And so just basic, ask them to create PowerPoint, 3 PowerPoint slides, present the case, give them the history and physical exam, what their differential diagnosis is, what their diagnosis is, why they ruled out those differentials, and then what the treatment plan is. And I know that process hopefully can be assigned to other areas and not just health professions education, but other parts of higher ed. And oftentimes, if we have students that are presenting, we like to have some sort of peer evaluation as well, whether you're evaluating peers in your group as far as how did they contribute to the case, or if it's something that is, an evaluation that they're doing of the students presenting in the class. So that can be a really tough way to ask students to complete work is to have if you have different tools that you're asking them to bounce between. I know, especially coming out of COVID, using different ed tech tools is really it's just really was a lot of taking up a lot of bandwidth of students' cognitive load to have them bounce between the different tech. And same with faculty. I know a lot of you were thrown into like this tech tool nightmare of using all these different things you'd never done before. So being able to put these Google Forms and Google Docs directly into Nearpod really eliminates that cognitive load stress for students to where as I'm advancing the slides, as you can see for you all right now, and now that I'm at the rubric stage, then students can easily just create complete the evaluation of their classmates. So it's a matter of asking them to enter their names, who they're evaluating, and then you have the rubric that I made here with drop downs in Google Forms. So students can easily score these. And so again, it's all within your Nearpod presentation to where you're ready to move on beyond this, you can. However, you can leave this open during the actual presentation as students are scoring their peers. Once they're done, you can have them add some comments and hit submit. So they're thinking critically about the performance they're seeing. I would require them to put comments as well to really let them show how critically they're able to think throughout that process. And then once at the end they hit submit, and now you've had the students that they've just evaluated their, done a peer evaluation of that presentation, which can go back to, again, you can provide case information like this, have students think critically about said case, or create the presentation off of this. And then once they get to their presentation, you just advance the slide, and now students are able to think critically and answer the rubric or fill out the rubric. For the record, ChatGPT made this entire rubric for me. This is even the titles here of content knowledge, visual aids, engagement, communication skills, and the rest of these. I didn't give it anything other than create a rubric for me that would evaluate students' performance on a case presentation. And so, to be honest, I didn't even vet what any of these said. I just for the sake of the example, copy and pasted. But for the most part, it's pretty solid, as you can see. Once done, they hit submit, and then you can move on to whatever your next slide is. Which my next slide is actually the question slide. So if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And I know Kevin's around to help with that, or in the Q&A as well. I see some in there. And then if you have questions about specific content, I tried to break these out. So if you have something specific about Nearpod, if you could just type it right here in the block below Nearpod, and we'll know how to answer those. So at this point, I'm going to take a breath and turn it back over to Kevin to see if we have any questions in the chat, as hopefully some pop up in the Nearpod here.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. Very much. It's great to learn that. I am still pretty new with using the AI, so definitely appreciate some direction and showing us how to save time with that. Here's a question from Crystal that just popped up. Is there an easier way to import multiple choice questions into Nearpod?
I'll let you take that initially, and then I'll have a follow-up maybe.
Sure. Creating multiple choice questions can be the time-consuming part. After you have those built, copying and pasting them into our pretty basic kind of template that shows question and then where to put your answer choices is really simple.
Yeah, agree. Now that the question writing part for me has been the longest part, so being able to have the AI generate those has been just a huge time saver. What I do a lot, if I have questions that have, let's say I'll have 4 distractors, is I create the first question and then I duplicate that. So I already have my 4 answer choices set instead of the 2 that it defaults to. It's just a fewer clicks, but if you're doing 20 questions, it saves you a lot of clicks overall and can knock some time off.
Good point. Here's one that came through a little bit ago, and it's maybe a little tougher question. How do you ensure that the use of AI by academic staff reflects, endorses, and models the faculty-wide key principles about the correct use of AI? For example, acknowledging sources, personalization of learning materials, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's I think something that a lot of institutions that I chat with about this kind of struggle with. And so what um, it, for me, it's a lot of this is about education and educating the faculty and educating the staff about how to appropriately use it. And so with that, it is to emphasize the personalization and saying, just as we would have done with a Google search or reading an article, that we take that information and then we then apply it to our lessons, and then we cite it with using the AI. Oftentimes, especially this works better with the paid version than the free version, but you can get it to provide sources. Always vet those sources, because with the free version, sometimes they're not great. But I'll even flip it, and instead of just having the AI create some content, if it is something I want to have it be more original from me, I'll put the topic in and say, hey, can you suggest some articles that can help me get started with this? And so I'll go that way and get the articles brought to me, almost kind of like a Google Scholar type search, only it's a little bit cleaner for me. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, we're really dependent on a group of human beings following what the rules and regulations are. So whether that's pre-AI or now in this AI era, that's just kind of where we're at as far as but it's still up to the individuals to follow the rules.
Yeah, that kind of segues right into another point that I've seen come up a few times. A new term to me, but artificial intelligence hallucinations, I guess. It seems like folks really still need to be kind of reviewing the content and making sure that it's correct. And is that how you feel about it as well?
Yeah, 100%. And I mentioned briefly during the talk that one of my primary concerns with AI is human complacency. And because there are times it produces things and it's just, you just go, oh, wow, that's terrific. And that we can kind of get a little complacent about, not just getting caught up in, that we have to do some evaluation. I've seen it do some brilliant work, and I've seen it make some glaring mistakes as well. But either way, everything that it produces before we then produce it first, especially if it's part of coursework or assessment, 100% need to evaluate that ourselves.
Yeah, good point. No one be worried. AI is not replacing us. It can't fix it.
Agreed.
There's a lot of things popping up here in the collaborate board now. I see one about very large class sizes. If you have more than 200, yes, absolutely, we can accommodate you. I am the representative for higher education, so I'm going to drop my scheduling link in the chat. If you're in the United States and you want to learn more about this, grab some time on my calendar.
Yeah, other things that I see in there as well. The how does the instructor access the results of the student rubric? If you use like a Google form, for example, in Google, it actually will dump all the results into a Google Sheet, which is their version of Excel. You can actually access that from the edit mode of the form. My email's at the top of this, so if you want to chat about that one offline, feel free to email me and I can show you that. It's a pretty simple step. The neat thing about if you're going to use rubric results that you have embedded in the Nearpod that jump and drop into Google Sheets is that it's all filterable and sortable. So if you want to see how all students evaluated one individual student, you want to see how Jane Doe did, you can sort by and filter by Jane Doe and then just get that specific feedback. So while you can even if you have a very large lecture, you can have students provide a lot of feedback and have a lot of data and information from that. You really can focus very specifically on what it is you want to look at. Any other questions as you're flipping through here? Kevin, that jump out to you?
One that popped up a few times is artificial intelligence integrated in Nearpod? Not yet. We do have the ability to embed that, not something that we showed today, but you can embed ChatGPT as a web content slide. So definitely something you can use and share, but it's not something that is yet integrated. I saw that come up a few times.
Yeah, and I see a couple questions too about something like a bank of ideas on how to make prompts or other demos of AI. I know we're a little short on time, so we're at 5 minutes now. That's one. Feel free to email me on that. I do have kind of a repository of prompts that I use, from writing learning objectives to mapping to course goals to writing multiple choice questions and the various levels of it. So I haven't typed out an original prompt in a couple months, to be honest, because I have this document that I use. So I'm happy to share that if you just ping my email there in the middle of the page. I have another question I wanted to address too, is that elaborate using AI to analyze transcripts to generate materials that support Nearpod lesson content. So what I do with that often is if I have an old lecture capture presentation, let's say, I will copy and paste that into the AI and ask it to write. I was asking it to write more questions than I want. So if I'm doing a 10-question quiz, I ask it to write 30 questions, let's say, because sometimes I get new ideas out of those 30 questions that prompts new learning opportunities. And B, I know some aren't going to be great, and I can trash those right away, and then I can go ahead and edit the others. From there, you can either embed the video into Nearpod. So if you want students to still watch that video, but you just use the transcript to write the questions, you can put the video into Nearpod in a couple different ways, which I'm sure Kevin can show you all that. You can even put the questions, embed them in the timeline of the video as well, to where it will stop the video and require students to answer that question before moving on. So there's different ways that you can interact with those questions. Again, for me, since everything else is copy and paste, the hardest part of that process is writing the assessment items and fast tracking that with AI and then dropping it back into the Nearpod has been a really big game changer in being able to create, those, as I mentioned before, those, critical thinking reps for students based on the content that we create for them. Any other items? I'm not gonna lie, Kevin, I haven't looked in the chat 'cause there's so many. Anything from there that have jump out before we end the session today?
It seems like things are wrapping up a bit. Yeah, folks are looking for some examples, but other than that, I think we're about wrapped up.
Okay, great. Well, if you need specific examples or want those prompts, as I mentioned before, my email is right at the top of the screen. I'm sharing still right now, just dan.thompson@OKState. Please feel free to send me a message and I'll gladly get back to you and share some of those different resources that I've created or used. Um, Other than that, Kevin, if you don't have anything else, everyone, we appreciate your time and feel free to reach out to us. And thanks again for joining us today.
Absolutely agree. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Dan. You're definitely working smarter and not harder. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Record. you